Urgent care is an independent medical specialty, and here in New Zealand there is a college that provides a postgraduate fellowship training programme. As it continues to develop, it has become an essential pillar in primary healthcare delivery, both here in New Zealand and around the world. Patients with acute illnesses or injuries that are not life-threatening, yet cannot wait for their regular doctor, look to urgent care clinics to provide their care. We want to highlight the work that urgent care doctors do, the training they undertake and the myriad of opportunities available to those who choose the urgent care vocation. We want to inspire the next generation of doctors to pursue a career in urgent care, to help meet the ever-growing demand for urgent medical services. My name is Guy Melrose, and these are profiles in urgent care. I'm passionate about urgent care, and proud that the Royal New Zealand College of Urgent Care is a world leader in the postgraduate medical training of doctors in this relatively new, yet rapidly developing specialty. There remains, however, a misunderstanding from both the public and the healthcare world as to what urgent care actually is, who provides it, and what training those providers have received. So to help explore some of these questions, and to promote urgent care training here in New Zealand, I plan to meet with fellows of our college and ask them why they chose urgent care, what it has allowed them to achieve in their life, and why they would recommend other doctors follow in their footsteps. For this first profile, I caught up over Skype with Dr Dinesh Deonarain. Dinesh is currently the Clinical Director of the newly opened Urgent Care Clinic in Marlborough, in the beautiful wine country of the top of New Zealand's South Island. He is a hard man to track down, for when he's not tending to Marlborough's urgent needs, or the needs of his family, Dinesh can be found out in the wilds of any one of Earth's 7 continents. Here he provides urgent medical attention to explorers, locals, and even potential Martians. But how did a Canadian national end up a Fellow of the Royal New Zealand College of Urgent Care? And how did brass bull's testicles play a part in the journey? I started at the beginning and asked him simply, why medicine?
Probably the best place to start really is the fact that I came from a very medical family, and so there's a certain aspect to it I think is probably a little bit faded, as we all know. Medicine is a bit of a family disease, so to speak. I was the youngest of 3, and interestingly enough, the youngest usually tries to forge their own path and go off in their own direction. So I was the most resistant to actually going into medicine, despite the insistence of my parents. They thought it would be a good career for obvious reasons. So at that time, I was in Canada. That's where I was raised. I grew up there. So my interest was predominantly in the outdoors, and I used to do a lot of outdoor activities. So when I got to university and I had this kind of open selection of things I could pursue, probably half to spite my parents and half to exercise my own will and interests, I actually applied and was accepted to study zoology. Now, I felt that studying animals was close enough to people to keep my parents appeased, but maybe that wasn't the case. So I actually entered the honors program at the University of Alberta in Western Canada, where I studied wildlife biology. And that to me was a fascinating time, because not only did it allow me to explore interests academically, but it had a very practical aspect to it as well too. And it actually put me in the outdoors, in places like Canada's high Arctic and the high alpine of the Canadian Rockies and the subarctic of the Yukon. So I think at that point, the die was cast in a sense of getting into the outdoors. So really the origins weren't medicine at all. I really didn't have a strong interest in going into medicine, but it's relevant to tell that backstory because my career path took a sharp turn, and I had plans to do a master's program of research with the Canadian government. And it was actually working on endangered species in Canada's high Arctic. And the year I was supposed to enter those studies, there was a change in government, and the funding to my master's program was pulled quite beyond my control. So as a result of that, I was really at a crossroads, and I really struggled to figure out what really, what everybody kind of at that age, asks themselves, what am I going to do with my life? Needless to say, my parents were still breathing down my neck a little bit. I was in my early 20s and facing this kind of, quarter life crisis, as people like to say. And I was at a complete loss, really, to be honest, in terms of what I was going to do. So I did what any kind of self-respecting young person would do at that time, which was basically travel. I just grabbed a backpack, and I can honestly say that I really did not have any plans. I had a little bit of money from having saved what I had from the Canadian Park Service, but no real plans around that. So I bought a plane ticket to London, I believe is where I arrived, and I spent the next 6 months actually backpacking through Europe, and really just kind of exploring it and kind of attending more of that university of life. Having had a strong academic grounding, I felt in some ways that I had missed out on the OE experience and a few other things in that regard. So during those travels, I found myself in Budapest, and I decided one day just to have a little stroll around the university. And I believe it was a holiday. It was a Sunday or maybe one of their university breaks, and there really wasn't too many people around. And I took in the university. It was quite beautiful, and past a rather remarkable statue, and there was a general sitting atop a bull. And this is where the story gets a little bit bizarre in a way, because the bull that the general was riding on had one conspicuous feature, and that was the fact that the testicles in the bull were actually polished to a bright shine. And that left me perplexed, to say the least. So I managed to find someone on campus. The first couple of people I asked, their English was limited, and they also didn't know the story. But eventually I found someone who had a bit of a laugh about it. And he turned to me and he said, "That statue there is sitting outside of the School of Medicine." And although the general himself had no connection with the medical school, the medical students would actually come out and rub the testicles of that bull prior to sitting their exams. And it was a huge tradition. And I remember laughing hysterically. But in that moment, I actually found myself doing the same thing that the medical students did and deciding to do medicine. So I would have to say my choice to do medicine was probably more unusual than most. I remember shortly after that, I did maybe a month more travel, but my thoughts were already coming back to Canada and already coming back to preparing for my medical school exams. And when I arrived back in Canada, I sat those exams, and really that's really what launched my kind of career in medicine. I committed myself to medicine after that, having trained in part in Canada and also going overseas in Europe as well to train. And really, I never looked back after that. So it was kind of an unusual way to start my medical career, but I did actually, in fact, write about it in my medical school entrance letter, and I'm sure it gave the entrance committee quite a laugh as well.
For someone whose entry to medicine involved a statue's brass appendages in one of Europe's historic capitals, it is not surprising to learn that Dinesh maintained an open mind regarding where his medical career would take him next. I'm starting to get the impression of a man with a love of travel and adventure, culture and learning.
Well, interestingly, I actually just consider myself lucky to have just gotten in at that time, and I was quite thankful. And really, I actually kept quite an open mind during my training and didn't have any strong specific interest. And as I went through, I've come to believe that what people end up doing chooses them as much as they choose it, in a sense. And I think people's natural aptitudes start to become apparent within medicine. For example, people that are, quite academic and detail oriented and like those kind of longer cerebral challenges tend to go into, say, more in-depth medical work. Those that are obviously kind of adept with their hands will go into procedural work. I liked a combination of both. So I did find myself, even in my training years, gravitating to, the primary care specialties, gravitating towards the emergency specialties, and to some degree, surgical specialties. So I knew those kind of areas were going to be on the horizon for me. I did prefer a little bit more kind of episodic care rather than kind of very long-term chronic care. So I think from this kind of swirling maelstrom of choices that you have in medical school, things do start to consolidate a little bit, to congeal a little bit, and you have some idea. Although I was never the kind of person, I think, in any point in my career to basically say, this is exactly what I want, I will exactly do this. I think I've always been the person to explore possibilities, and once I get a feel for something, basically navigate my way, using that feel. And I like to think sometimes it's your heart and your gut that does make the best choices, and I don't think I'd be disappointed, I think, in that regard.
I guess for someone who loves the outdoors, travelling and whitewater rapids, it was only a matter of time before New Zealand appeared on his to-do list.
Yeah, that's an interesting question. So I had a couple of different influences in terms of why I actually came to New Zealand. So at that time, I had a friend, a good friend of mine, unrelated to medicine, actually. He was actually a person I used to whitewater kayak with. And he had taken a trip recently to New Zealand. And he came back with some photos, and they literally were stunning. It had almost this quasi kind of subtropical, jungle appearance, and crashing through the white water. And I was fascinated. Obviously, a very different topography and geography to the part of Canada where I grew up in. So I was fascinated. I think that kind of hibernated in my psyche for quite a while, actually. And then, interestingly enough, I was flicking through quite randomly through a medical journal, and it had a small ad just in the corner, asking if you had any interest in working in New Zealand. And it is almost like a scene from a movie, because I remember, cutting out that small article, tacking it to my corkboard in my office at home, and then eventually, just pulling it off the wall and calling the number. And so when I came across, it was very much going to be a working holiday. I was going to just do a little bit of emergency locum work, get a feel for New Zealand, just have a little bit of a holiday, really, more so than anything else. And I think it was, from that trip that I really kind of, sank my teeth into living and traveling in New Zealand, and really got a real affection for the country. And I think eventually I came around to making the decision that I would stay, but I don't think, even after that first experience, that it was a terribly difficult decision to make.
Working in an emergency department, whilst exploring all that New Zealand has to offer, would seem to be ticking all the boxes for Dinesh. I was interested to know when urgent care appeared on his radar.
Yeah. So that's a good question. So as I mentioned, I came across to do emergency locum work, and I actually had been involved with training in ED at Waikato Hospital, and was prepared to continue on there in ED training, and had worked my way up to registrar there, and was getting some very, very good experience and a great team there. And urgent care was basically mentioned to me in passing, and I knew really little about it other than some exposure, from obviously coming from Canada and having sisters in the States. There is urgent care facility in those countries, so it wasn't something that was entirely foreign to me, but it was still somewhat unknown. So it was basically upon the mention of a friend who was becoming more and more involved in urgent care that encouraged me to do that, and kind of to tell me a little bit about what it was, and the fact that the training program in New Zealand was becoming a lot more organized. And I started to cast kind of just a casual glance at urgent care, went onto the website. And at that time, the Urgent Care College was very much working aggressively towards obtaining fellowship status and obtaining a Royal College status. So obviously basically rising at that time as well too. So that was a very interesting time to start to get involved with it. So yeah, so I think it's always a bit disconcerting to try and make a move from ground that you feel is quite safe and steady into something that's a little bit unknown. And I think After that time, I had already done about 8 years of postgraduate work. I was kind of, on track to continue with that, but urgent care became more appealing, and largely because of kind of lifestyle factors. So I investigated it a little bit more independently. I talked to a few people who were involved in the training. Had a close look in terms of where I felt urgent care was going, and I decided to pick up training along that stream. And thankfully, I was credited with a lot of my emergency work that I had done in the program. And then, once I had made that leap, probably quite similar to, my decision to do medicine in the first place, I often find myself, once I commit to something, I don't really spend a lot of time looking back, and I'm quite happy with the decision that I made.
Having made the leap to urgent care, what does an adventure-loving urgent care doctor do next, I wondered? What work opportunities opened up to him as a result of his urgent care training?
Yeah, and that's another interesting question too, and I think that's represented another kind of stage in my development, as a practitioner as well too. So my current role is the clinical director of the Urgent Care College in Marlborough. It's my third time as a clinical director. The first time being the clinical director of the Ruapehu Alpine Lifts, actually the medical clinics on the ski fields in New Zealand, which was a fantastic way to combine, my interest in the outdoors and obviously my urgent care skills.
Let me just cut in there a second. He just said urgent care on a ski field. Now, for those of you that don't know, Ruapehu is a large, active volcano in the central North Island of New Zealand that every winter provides great skiing opportunities. But it sounds like he just said there was an urgent care clinic on the ski field.
It is. So interestingly enough, Ruapehu has basically a level 2 accident medical, but it's basically an urgent care on both sides of the mountain, so on the Turo side and the Whakapapa side, with full X-ray diagnostics and the ability to plaster. So it's actually quite an interesting job from that point of view, with a lot of acuity. There's a lot of morbidity that actually happens, obviously, on ski fields in that kind of environment, not just inbounds, but people that are exploring the side country and the back country as well. And so from that facility, I actually had the pleasure of being the clinical director for a couple, 3 seasons there. And I remember auditing, for example, the helicopter use, and we typically in a season have 30, 40 helicopters taking, acutely injured, sometimes critically injured patients off the mountain for care. So there was really a lot of fantastic acute care experience in that environment. And obviously, because it was an urgent care as well too, you're drawing a lot on your urgent care skills, in particular radiography and diagnostics, to manage a lot of those cases.
Now, urgent care is technically described as a walk-in service, albeit people do sometimes need a wheelchair to get in from their car. But surely working on a ski field must pose some logistical issues. I'm imagining this was more mountain rescue than urgent care clinic.
Well, you are de facto part of, I believe it's called RARO, so it's the Ruapehu Alpine Rescue Organization. And so you're de facto part of that. It is usually the ski patrols that are responsible for the retrieval. That's really their mandate. There are a few times, though, that you are required on the field. And those definitely get the adrenaline up. You get the call on the radio, and they'll give you about 2 minutes to kind of get your gear, which is just hanging by the door, the radio and everything like that, and the medical bag. And the next thing you hear is a snowmobile roaring at the front door, and you tear out the front door, you jump on the back, and I don't know if you've ever been on the back of a snowmobile going uphill on a 45-degree slope at about 40 kilometers an hour, it seems. It's rather exhilarating itself. So there's definitely some interesting moments that do happen in an alpine environment, even on a commercial ski field like Ruapehu. But those are rare. Usually the ideal situation, just like in a hospital situation, it's best for the patient to be brought to a stable facility and either resuscitated or treated in that environment rather than kind of on the snow.
So after the exhilaration of the ski field, where did his urgent care training take him next?
The next one being a co-director at Henderson White Cross Clinic, which was another fantastic experience because it was a great team and a huge volume. It functions actually almost more like a small hospital, small emergency department. So I gained, I think, a lot of experience, not only as a clinician, but as a director there. And it really prepared me for my current role, which is the clinical director at the urgent care clinic in Marlborough. And it's a new service. It was introduced in December of last year. Again, a great team, a young team that's really keen to learn, and it's really provided some great benefits for the community. So it's really interesting to see what happens when you get an urgent care clinic arriving de novo in an area that has never had it, and to see the immediate impact it has. And I think that's why I signed on with them, because it was exciting to be involved, not with necessarily an established clinic, but a clinic that was starting from scratch and being able to be one of the players shaping the culture, not only of the clinic, but of urgent care in the area. And thankfully, I'm happy to say that there's been tremendous engagement from the community in terms of St. John Ambulance, the community soliciting the facility, the Nelson Marlborough District Health Board, the emergency department, the ancillary services. So it's being really well supported around that development. And we're already decompressing the ED consistently in the area of about 15 patients per day off their list, which is a pretty sizable number for a small ED to be not having to deal with in any 24-hour period. So great success story already, and we hope to continue on that trajectory. And it's been a real a pleasure and an honor to be part of that as the clinical director.
So having trained in urgent care, Dinesh has spent time working on ski fields, in a busy Auckland city clinic, and started a new urgent care clinic in wine country. 3 very different environments in which to practice. But for a Canadian with a love of the wilderness, was he still able to scratch that adventurous itch, or has he left that all behind?
Yeah, very much so. And I think, as I mentioned, I don't think I was ever able to escape. And I don't think anybody that really kind of grows up in rural parts of Canada ever really escapes it. So I mentioned, one of my first incarnations was to be a zoologist, really, to be a wildlife biologist outdoors. And I think that thread has, stuck with me throughout my career. And I've always wanted to kind of retain that. And I think as a doctor, I was set to actually put that on a back burner and say, well, that will only just ever be, an involved hobby, and I'll have to find the time to do it. But what I found, quite to my surprise, was that I was able to actually incorporate medicine and the outdoors into wilderness medicine, which is another burgeoning field, actually. Admittedly quite fringe, but growing in interest. So my day job as a clinical director, I often describe that as my, sort of like Clark Kent sort of a job. And then whenever I get a chance to pursue any wilderness medicine, you feel like you get to find a phone booth and change into your cape and wear your underpants on the outside. Because needless to say that the medicine is always very interesting, very challenging. It takes you to exotic places. And so it's very much a deviation from what you would do in your day job, but it applies the same skills. So for those that don't know, wilderness medicine is basically defined as the practice of medicine in austere environments with limited access to care, using basically the basic application of medical skills and facing kind of great logistical challenges. And I think my interest in it was, again, in a way, by chance. I was looking for courses to take, while I was an ED trainee, what courses might I get credit for? I had a friend in the UK and that I wanted to visit. And I happened to find a wilderness course that was offered by Expedition Medicine UK. And I just signed on, this is a bit of a lark. And I found myself during the course, first of all, it was a very well presented course and had a lot of great practical stations, but I found myself instantly being hooked. And I found myself all being surprised that I hadn't come across this sooner, because it was such an obvious marriage between my interests and my current career, that it seemed like such an obvious fit. And needless to say, I continued on in wilderness medicine training, acting as an expedition doctor on a number of expeditions, and now I'm lucky enough to hold a fellowship in wilderness medicine and be an instructor and start to pay back some of those skills as well.
It would seem then that Dinesh has found a way to mix his professional qualifications with his love of the wilderness and outdoors. But does his urgent care training and day-to-day practice assist his wilderness medicine role? Are the skills and attributes transferable?
Yeah, I'd say definitely there is, and it's interesting. It's not dissimilar that you'd notice maybe at first pass. Obviously the two seem very different. Urgent care practice is obviously kind of an urgent care, an urban practice by and large, and wilderness medicine, is practiced, anywhere but. Having said that, the skill set, I believe, to be quite transferable, because you have to use actually quite a basic and practical skill set in both contexts. And I think urgent care doctors actually function well in wilderness settings, because they're used to being in situations where, for example, immediate diagnostics and immediate advanced care is not at their fingertips. So they use a little bit more of their own nous, their own resourcefulness. And I think really that is one of the strong links between them, is that a person who has very good clinical acumen functions, I find, very well in both those environments, and the skills are very much transferable.
Travelling to the most remote parts of the world is a costly pursuit, not just financially, but also in terms of time commitments. I wanted to know if urgent care, as well as having crossover skills with wilderness medicine, allows Dinesh the flexibility to get into that phone booth, don his cape and head out into the wilds. I wanted to know if he is able to achieve a work-life balance, and is it a satisfying one?
Definitely. There's a great flexibility in urgent care, and because it is a very new field as well too, there's a lot of opportunities in it, and I find that people in the organizations that administrate urgent care as well too are happy to, offer people part-time, flexible work schedules in order to kind of service their workforce. And so I think it's a great sort of career to have other interests, whether it would be something like wilderness medicine or any other special interests outside of medicine, or even as a parallel stream to medicine. I think urgent care is a starting point and a really good career to have in order to, use that flexibility to move yourself in directions that interest you beyond urgent care. I think there is, a really nice work-life balance with people who pursue careers in urgent care. First of all, I feel that most people do feel kind of challenged in their careers in urgent care. There's enough breadth to explore different aspects of medicine, and also there's the capacity to explore more deeply areas of special interest within urgent care. Also, the flexibility that you mentioned, basically buys you time and allows you to pursue interests. It also buys you time for other very practical things, spending time with family and friends. I think it's also a program that is easily accessible in terms of training. I think the people at the college have been very accessible and very reasonable in terms of people's interests when they come to the college. And I think postgraduately as well too, it's very easy to access postgraduate training and maintain your skills in your CME with the recertification program, and also basically seeking CME outside of that, because there's a tremendous overlap, as we mentioned, between general practice and emergency. So finding courses to keep your skills up is not difficult. As well, there is a growing field of urgent care worldwide that was offering specific urgent care training on a CMA basis as well too. And I think the last point on that, the why it provides a good work-life balance is that there's just a demand. There's demand now. It is a very much a growing field, and with demand comes a certain certainty with employability, a certain job security, a certain remuneration comes along with that, as well as I think maintaining elements of that flexibility that which was the point that we started on. So I think there's a number of positives why that work-life balance is actually quite well maintained within urgent care.
Now, as an urgent care physician myself, I'm keen to hear some stories about some of the cases Dinesh has been involved with out in the wilds. I asked him if he could recount a case that demonstrates urgent care in the wilderness, something that shows the application of urgent care skills outside of an urgent care facility.
Yeah, that's a great question. And it's interesting when you ask a question like that. I mean, your mind does kind of reel through the number of interesting kind of cases that you come across when you do start to work in unusual locations. I think there are a number that spring to mind, and I'll just mention one. And it sounds like a very simple case, but it can be interesting how when you add elements of remoteness to the mix, a seemingly simple case can become quite difficult. And really, I was working in the high altitude in the Annapurna in Nepal, and we had an aid station there, and there was a porter who developed actually quite a nasty nosebleed. He had a background history of hypertension, and he had been prone to them previously. But this one, he'd been just kind of tramping through it for probably the last hour. It was just this kind of bleed that was becoming a little bit problematic. So when we saw him, he probably had been bleeding, relatively consistently for the last hour. And my colleague was a very experienced physician from Harvard, American doctor, trained in Harvard Medical School, and he actually took the case on. It was technically my day off, and he was trying to manage this case for probably another hour, trying to get on top of this epistaxis. Now, in his practice, as a medical consultant, he had obviously very advanced knowledge in medical conditions, and he was a fantastic doctor to work with, but he struggled a little bit with the epistaxis case. Because that wouldn't be something that he would normally come across in his typical practice. So he did come up to call me and said, "Hey, do you mind having a look at this gentleman?" And I came down, and by then it was a fairly roaring epistaxis. And when you're in the high alpine, something that starts as a relatively benign condition like epistaxis can actually potentially become life-threatening, because you're now faced with the logistics. It was now approaching evening, and the weather was coming in. And actually getting this person to definitive care, which ultimately would have been Kathmandu, is now becoming a huge logistical nightmare. So the imperative or the urgency in getting this, quote unquote, sorted was definitely coming into the mix. So I think in that regard, my urgent care skills served me well, because basically I remembered this being a station in my training and learning about epistaxis. And a lot of it was having a systematic approach to the problem that you're faced with. So basically, I started from the start. I brought him, into a controlled space, made sure the position was good, the lighting was good, making sure, that my equipment was there, that I had some assistance, that I had all the drugs I need, that I took some care and time to clear the clot that was only partially obstructing the flow, and then basically managed definitively the epistaxis. And the good news is that we were able to stabilize it with cautery and simple packing, and we had the capacity to actually observe him. By then it was, close to nighttime, and we wouldn't have been able to get him out there to more definitive care. But thankfully, with that kind of very systematic and structured approach, which I was really drawing heavily on my urgent care skills, we were able to stabilize that patient, and it was a good outcome for him. And to this day, I get messages, through the Sherpa wireless that he was doing well, and he was very thankful for the care that he received. So I think that's a relatively simple example of, be one of the ones I dealt with in an austere situation that I think reflects some of the skill set that you can bring to situations like that.
It is clear from talking to Dinesh, he has a lot more stories to tell, and frankly, I could listen to them all day. But as someone who has suffered a dislocated shoulder and also a near-death whitewater rafting experience, the next story really caught my attention.
An expedition to Central America, and it was a part of the expedition involved a rafting section down the Pacuare River. And there was a group of probably about 8 to 10 of us in the boat with the guide on the oars. And we had just completed a section, or we were going through a section of about class 4 to 4+ rapids. And one of the team members actually was ejected from the raft. And I'd spent actually quite a bit of time in Canada rafting and kayaking. And so I had quite a comfort and familiarity. And I noticed right away when he was ejected that he actually seemed to strike probably maybe the oarlock on the way out. Something very awkward about the way he actually kind of went over the edge of the boat. And when he surfaced, thankfully he was quite close to the boat, had a very pained expression on his face. And I could tell this wasn't just simply a person who was shocked from landing in the water. And he wasn't able to, I noticed right away, he was actually only holding onto the raft with one hand. And we were still probably in pretty swift water at the time. And you could tell his face was becoming not just pained, but panicked. and he wasn't able to bring his other arm up to lift himself out. Now, what I did is it was almost instinctual, actually, this maneuver that you use to bring people back into the boat. So grabbing onto the, basically the lapels, if you will, of the life jacket and throwing him over me and bringing him into the boat. It looks quite awkward, but it's actually a very quick way to get someone back into a raft, especially when it's going over rapids. And when I did that, the rest of the team was sort of looking, and we propped him back up. But I noticed immediately he had an anterior dislocation of his shoulder, and that probably explained the expression on his face. And everybody on the group was actually starting to become more focused on him than the rapids and not listening to the raft guide. So there was a growing sense of urgency as a result of this dislocation in this member, who was actually looking a little bit peaky at the time as a result. So again, the second reflex kicked in, where I did a very quick scapular manipulation and external rotation to his arm, popped his shoulder back, threw him down in the middle, grabbed his oar and took his position, and told people to continue to paddle. The guide himself was quite thankful that we did that, because we were actually just about to go over the next drop. And actually what was really interesting, just in terms of, sometimes you just need that kind of MacGyver sort of approach to it. I basically just tucked his elbow inside of his life jacket and then cinched him up really tight, and then let the point of his elbow come out through the armhole. And so it actually was just in essentially just the broad arms sling, somewhat modified for the circumstances. So you become just quite practical. You're like, well, that's just going to support his shoulder from bouncing around, because if I leave it out, he's actually going to, maybe try and stabilize himself, put his arm down reflexively, and he's actually probably going to pop it out again.
Despite many more stories to tell, I decided to move on by asking where in the world has his medical training taken him. Now, in hindsight, I maybe should have phrased the question, where in the solar system can your training take you?
Yeah, that's a great question. I won't try to give an exhaustive list. Above and beyond, my interest in wilderness medicine, I find I travel obviously for my own interest's sake. So I've always had a bit of a travel bug. But I mean, suffice it to say that interestingly enough, wilderness medicine has now brought me to every continent now. I'm counting it in terms of continents on the planet, and I think it's interesting. Rather than thinking in terms of country, I often think of it in terms of environments. So it's really interesting to push yourself into different environments. And the most challenging, you first of all, you start in areas that you know. So a lot of the expeditions I did initially were in kind of forested areas similar to Canada, including expeditions in Canada, and then, into northern areas, which I was also quite comfortable with, and eventually into polar areas, including Antarctica. So those areas, you start to push yourself further and further. And the last one I went on was actually just a training course, but it was because it represented to me in my mind the natural extension of things. And that was to participate in a Mars simulation, which was held in the Utah desert. And to me, that was fascinating, because that represents probably the most extreme austere situation that you can find yourself, where you're extraplanetary. And in this world that we live in today, 2018, we are actually, making quite big steps towards extraterrestrial, in particular Mars habitation. So this is no longer science fiction. This is something real. And their ability to choose crews and what medical skills would be required would probably draw on the basic tenets of wilderness medicine. So being part of that crew and being selected for that crew was a fascinating time. And I was with probably a crew of about 12 other people. And it was run by NASA experts. And basically, they were doing their own observations on us and how we behaved in a habitat situation. And they would, put us out in simulated medical rescue scenarios in the Utah desert, and basically kitted up and suited up as if we were astronauts operating in that environment. And I think that was one of the most fascinating courses to go on, because it really, really opened up the realm of what's possible. It really took the ceiling off what's possible in terms of what we do in medicine. And I hope it probably won't be me, strapped into, one of the SpaceX rockets. but hopefully, even hearing this, some people get those ideas in their head, and, maybe in less than a generation from now, that will very much be a reality for someone else.
Now, one last question on wilderness medicine. How would anyone listening who is interested in getting involved find out more about this branch of medicine?
Well, if you go to the website for the Southland Wilderness Medicine Wilderness Group, they have a Facebook page. You can find out about courses there. You can search under the AWS. If people are interested in getting in touch with me personally, I could probably leave some information with the show notes as well, and have something available so people could get in touch with me if they were interested.
Right, now back to urgent care. I asked Dinesh for an elevator pitch for a young or not so young doctor that might sell them on the benefits of a career in urgent care.
Well, I think this is going to be a career that appeals to people who actually value that flexibility and autonomy in their career, and that have an interest to be challenged in a broad sense. Anything can walk in the door in urgent care, including high acuity. So you have to kind of enjoy that kind of breadth of exposure. The flexibility, as we mentioned, in terms of what you can do with it once you are a trainee and once you are a fellow and once you are employed in urgent care, I think that's great. The fact that you have access to relevant training, I think is a great thing. I think also what makes it quite exciting is that it's a growing field. And I think if you get involved in urgent care at this stage, you actually find yourself in a position to shape the profession itself, shape the direction of urgent care, especially in an area in a country as small as New Zealand. You have a direct influence. A lot of my friends now are, on committees with urgent care, are actively involved in education. Myself, I've been involved in education, and am very interested in the direction that the college is taking. And I think also it is part of a practice which has now become quite relevant. As I mentioned, it sits very nicely between, the megaspheres of general practice and emergency medicine. But if you look and take a glance back in history, everything starts somewhere. Once upon a time, surgeons were barbers. Once upon a time, emergency physicians and consultants were simply physicians who had returned in the middle of the last century from the Great Wars. So from humble beginnings often come great things, and I think it's really exciting to be part of something at an entry level and to be part of that growth, and to know that you have the ability to actually shape or influence how that grows in the future.
I feel that, unlike a lot of medical training pathways out there that narrow your career options as you ascend the ladder, urgent care training leaves doors open, whilst at the same time opening up new doors. Is that something Dinesh would subscribe to?
It is, yeah. That's a very good description, very good conceptualization of it. I think the fact that I don't think, and probably you've gathered just through our conversation today, that I never look at anything really as an open and shut case. I think actually it's one thing that you grow and develop in will then provide you the launching pad for your next pursuit. And I think urgent care is a great field for that, because it can allow you to grow in a different direction and not be limiting, like you said, in any particular way, and a great adjunct to other careers and other training.
Dinesh has travelled the world, practiced medicine in some of the most remote places on the planet, and been an active contributor to the growth of urgent care here in New Zealand. He is the epitome of urgent care. He is flexible, adaptive, broadly skilled, and able to see the bigger picture. He's not followed a well-worn path through medicine, but carved out his own journey. Urgent care has been the ideal companion on that journey, allowing him to fulfil his duties and responsibilities as a physician, whilst never losing sight of the important things in his life, the parts we should never overlook, things that nourish our soul and make us smile. I asked Dinesh to wrap things up with his thoughts on the future.
Maybe I might leave you with this last little story. When I worked in Nepal, one of the patients I used to check on was a Tibetan monk who was now in her 90s, and she lived quite high, and it would probably be about, she's getting close to 5,000 meters. She lived in a small hermitage, site, and I would have to hike up, the blood pressure cuffs and the glucometer and, a few other bells and whistles to check on her. And needless to say, she'd invite me in. We'd have butter tea. We'd talk. I'd usually spend a few hours there. Sometimes I'd overnight there. And I remember remarking that she was a person who, despite her 90-odd years of age, had this tremendous childlike fascination about life and interest. And I think it's something that really left an impression. And if I can continue to maybe take a leaf from her book and live life in that way, I think opportunities, come to you, and you find yourself being quite excited by the opportunities. Probably we mentioned, what challenges might be in the future for me. I mean, one of the biggest challenges I find, despite the experiences I've had, is I've recently become a father, and the challenges of a youngster have paled have paled some of the experiences I've had in wilderness medicine. I mean, definitely I've faced a lot of challenges now running after a youngster.
So there we have it. From the wilds of Canada to the South Island of New Zealand, taking in every continent in between. Dinesh's story serves to highlight how an urgent care career need not be a linear, predetermined line, but can snake its way around the world, allowing you to live your life the way you want to. Whilst by no means every urgent care doctor needs to be trekking across the Himalayas or popping shoulders back in on the white waters of Central America, urgent care training and practice can allow your work and your life to find a satisfying synergy. I will leave Dinesh with the last word.
I'm very grateful with the experiences I've had. I think the college has been really supportive throughout both my early training and now as a fellow. I think some of the friendships that I've made in urgent care are lifelong friendships. They're some of my best friends. And I think that speaks volumes to the college itself and the people that it acts as a hub for, that it brings together. My name is Dinesh Deonarain, and I'm an urgent care physician.